Hey everybody, it's Rob here at together.If, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 air helper springs for the rear on our 2017 Ford F-150. Now before we actually put our bags on, we like to take our truck out on a test course, get an idea of the baseline of how our truck handles, and whenever we put a load in the back as well. That way whenever we do have our bags installed, we can take a really good test and have something to compare it to. And we all know everybody wants to see them working, but we also know that you want to see how to get them installed. And if you stick around at the end of the video, we are going to go through that process together. If you're looking for airbags for your truck, it's most likely because you either haul a heavy load in the bed of your truck or you tow a trailer pretty often, and most likely it's probably a pretty heavy load or trailer. And we all know whenever you hook up a heavy load or trailer to the back of your truck, the back end starts sagging, we get an uncomfortable ride, and there's a lot of things that happen that really aren't that good for our truck or for our ride quality. But our airbags are going to help alleviate a lot of those problems because they're going to be back here supporting that load and not allowing the back end to drop down so far. So that way our suspension can be where it's supposed to be, supporting that load. We can have a comfortable ride, and we don't have to deal with all the symptoms that we get when we're towing a heavy load. Now before we get too far along, I would like to take a measurement and get a baseline idea of where our truck is sitting in the back. So right here, if I measure about the center of the wheel well, our truck is measuring right about 41.5 inches. Now you do need to keep in mind that our truck does have oversized tires, so your truck may not be at the exact same height, but we're looking for a difference here. So at stock height, we're at 41.5, and if we move to the front, we can check the front as well. The front's coming in right about 40 inches. So now we know the stock height of our truck. Let's go ahead and take it on our test course, go over a few of the bumps course and the slalom course, and see how it handles without any weight and without the bags installed. I'm going to go over the bumps at about 5 miles an hour, just so we have a nice baseline run. Now this is just going to be so we can kind of compare it once we get a weight in the back of the truck and once we have our bags on. Obviously our truck's going to drive pretty normal because there's nothing changed about it right now. And honestly, the suspension is doing a pretty good job of what it's supposed to do. Don't get me wrong, there's bumps, obviously. But it's a pretty normal feeling bump. It's not an over dramatic bump. It's not jarring through the seat because we still have the full travel of our suspension and it can do its job. So now as we come up to the slalom course, again, just going to be for a baseline run so we have something to compare it to. And we're going in and out of the turns about 10 miles an hour, again, so we have something really good to compare it to once we put the weight in and put the bags on. And honestly, again, drives pretty much how you would expect it to. There's not any over dramatic body roll. There's a little bit, but it's a truck, it's not a sports car. But again, it's still pretty comfortable. It's kind of, again, what you would expect. I don't have any feeling of the truck leaning over real hard. There's not a lot of body roll. It's pretty controllable. It's not very loose, it's not very soft. Right where you want it to be, pretty normal. But let's go ahead and add a load to the back and see how that affects how our truck drives. So you can see we added a large amount of weight to the bed of our truck. And visually, you can already tell that the back end is sagging down just by the gap in between the tire and the wheel well. And if I take the same measurement from the center of the tire to the wheel well, it's actually dropped about 2.5 inches back here. Now up front, it's actually caused the front end to come up because it's acting like a teeter-totter, pulling that back end down and stretching the front end up. And up front here, it actually went up about an inch. So there's a lot of different things that are happening once we add all that weight. The back end goes down. Again, we're going to have a rough ride. Our suspension doesn't have as much travel as it should. And then up here, since the front end's being pulled up, we don't have all the weight on our tires, which means our steering is going to be diminished, our braking is going to be diminished, our tires are going to start wearing funny because once we start pulling that up, the camber and caster starts getting off, our headlights are going to be pointing up at the sky. There's just a lot of different things that all add up and give us an uncomfortable ride and all those symptoms that we have when we're carrying a heavy load. So let's go ahead and take our truck back onto the test course with the load and see how it handles. So again, we'll go about 5 miles an hour over our speed bump course just to keep that nice baseline. Even after hitting that first bump, it's pretty obvious that we have a pretty heavy load in the back. even again, the front end is reacting a little bit different, and there's definitely a lot more of a jarring feeling coming from the seat, because every time the back end goes over, you really get more of a feel of the bump. It's a little bit more dramatic, and it definitely has more of a loose feeling up front. Now again, we're gonna go about 10 miles an hour through the slalom course, and I already have a feeling that the going in and out of the turns does feel a little loose. It doesn't really feel like I have a whole lot of control, because initially as I go into the turn, it doesn't really react, and then it starts to lean really hard, and part of it is because we have water in the bed, so it's sloshing around, shifting the weight, but you can definitely feel all the weight transfer going back and forth, especially when you go through the turn. As you come to finish it, it kind of still wants to carry you into the turn. Just a very loose, kind of mushy feeling, getting a lot of body roll, and it just doesn't really feel like I'm in as much control as I would like to be. So I went ahead and put that same load in the back of the bed, and now if we measure, we're just barely under the factory ride height, and we have about 45 pounds in our bag. Now if we move up to the front, we can check to see if the front end has come up or if it's back to where it should be. And up here, we're right back where we should be, right back to that factory ride height. So now we know our truck is sitting where it should be, but let's see how it handles with the load and the bags in place. So again, I'm gonna be going about 5 miles an hour over the speed bump course. As I come up to the first bump, it's surprisingly a lot softer than when we had no bags in place. It's not quite at the place it was when there was no weight at all and it was just a factory ride, but this is much more comfortable and much more reactive. So once we get over the bump, I don't have to worry about the back end continuing to bounce and the front end feeling really loose. Now again, on our slalom course, we're going about 10 miles an hour, so we have something to compare it to that's really close. And even just these first couple turns can already feel a difference, especially in the body roll. It doesn't have such of a soft feeling, so much body roll going on. It's much more responsive. As I turn, it wants to turn, and it's not so much of a leaning and then going into the turn. And even as we come out of the turn, it doesn't want to oversteer and I have to crank on the wheel to get it going back straight. It's a little bit more stable. Like I said, it's just a lot easier to drive and genuinely feels like it wants to go a little bit faster. Don't get me wrong, I realize the load's back there, I can feel it while I'm driving, but it definitely feels like a much lighter load than it is, and it's definitely a lot easier to control. So overall, I think our bags definitely helped out. Definitely made me feel more comfortable driving. I felt more in control, and it was definitely a lot more comfortable. Again, not exactly like the quality ride from the factory, but we did have a lot of weight in the back. We're going over speed bumps, and it was actually a really good ride considering all those things. But I do realize that a lot of people out there are wondering what the ride quality is going to be like when you have the minimum amount of air pressure in the bags and no load. So I wanted to take the time, we're going to take our truck back out on the test course, and I'll give you a good idea of what it's going to like to be riding in your truck every day without a load. So far going over the speed bumps, it's a little bit stiffer than the stock ride, but not a whole lot. And mainly, only whenever we go over really large bumps with the solid speed bumps. The alternating speed bumps aren't too bad. But again, the upside to having bags is because we need them for the support. So a little bit, and I do mean a little bit, it's not a rough ride, it's not an uncomfortable ride by any means. But there's a slight difference. If you expect your truck to ride exactly the same, it's not. There's a little bit of a difference, but I think the benefit outweighs the downside in this aspect. Now let's see how it handles on our slalom course. As I'm going in and out of the turns, I don't really notice a huge difference in the ride quality compared to the factory ride with no weight. So regular turns, body roll, it may help a little, but not enough for me to notice. I was mainly concerned more about the stiffness of the ride because of those internal jounce bumpers. But like I said, it's not enough that you're really going to dramatically notice it or have Buyer's remorse, I still think it's a comfortable ride. If you like the way your F-150 rides, it's not going to change that much with the bags. But realize that when you don't have any weight, it may be a little bit stiffer. So here's what our bags look like once we have them installed. They're going to fit right in between our axle and the frame, so that whenever we do have a load, they're going to be there to help support it. Now, the nice thing about it is that we are going to have one spring on each side of the axle. So it is not only going to help out support the heavy load back here, but it's also going to help with off-center loads. A lot of us may have a trailer that we pull, maybe heavier on one side, or maybe we have something in the bed that's heavier on one side. Well, the nice thing about it is we can put more pressure in one bag than the other and level it side to side and front to back. So our airbags are going to replace our factory jounce stops. Now, our factory jounce stops are really only there to prevent the frame from hitting the axle. These aren't going to provide us any support, because if they were, you can see how high they are from the axle, and by the time they get down and actually touch, we've already lost several inches of clearance and the back end's already coming down. But what's really going to make our bags stand out compared to other bags is that they actually have an internal jounce bumper inside the airbag. Now, the good part about that is if in the event that we lose a lot of air from our airbag all at once, maybe we don't have enough air in there, we're not going to have to worry about the bag crushing in on itself and causing any damage, because that internal jounce bumper is going to stop it before it comes down too far. Now, the downside to that is there have been a few customers that kind of let us know, they said, you know, when you're not carrying anything, you're not towing anything, and there's very light amount of air pressure in the bags, it does limit the amount of travel, because we don't have this full amount because the bump stop is inside. So depending on where you live, the road conditions and everything else, it may stiffen it up a little bit. Our airbags are designed for heavy-duty applications like half-ton, three-quarter ton, and one-ton trucks, and even some motorhomes. Now, our bags are going to provide us with 5,000 pounds of load leveling support. Now, keep in mind that doesn't mean that it's going to add 5,000 pounds to the payload of our truck. It's just going to help support that weight and give us a comfortable ride. So you do want to double-check your Ford's owner's manual and never exceed the manufacturer's recommended weight. The way you're going to adjust your bags and adjust the amount of pressure you need is through the manual inflation valves. Now, we chose to mount ours here at the back at the bumper because they're really easily accessible and we know which one's left and right. Now, one thing to keep in mind with airbags is that the main point of them is that we have the adjustability. So if you changed a lot of loads, or if you have several different trailers with different loads in them, it makes it really easy to get the type of support and they fine-tune it down to get the truck riding the way you want. But something to keep in mind is that every time we change a load, we should be adjusting our air pressure to match that load. So if you're carrying a really heavy trailer, you're probably going to want to have your bags up a little bit higher, and then if you drop that load and pick a smaller one, you're probably going to want to drop down some air. And that's why I always recommend a compressor. An onboard compressor is going to make it a lot easier for us to fill or deflate the bags. We can do it from the comfort of our cab, and we don't even have to get out, lug around an air compressor, get the hose out, and do anything like that. We're not even going to have to stop at the gas station or anything, because all we have to do is to control everything from the inside of our truck. My personal favorite compressor available for airbags is going to be the Air Lift wireless compressor, because it is wireless and it's much easier to install, but it does a really good job of adjusting the bags, just making it really convenient for you. But now that we've seen what our bags look like, gone over some of the features, let's go and go through the installation process together. To begin our installation, we want to park our truck on a nice flat level surface. Now we're going to need to lift up the back end of our truck, but we want to make sure that we lift it by the frame so the axle and the suspension can hang down and have a little bit of room in between. Now we're using a drive-on lift, so we are going to have to come up with a different way to lift it up. And we're actually going to be using a jack at the back of the hitch here so we can lift up the frame. But right now we want to move underneath, and we're going to move right to the rear axle right above it at the frame. Right above the rear axle on the bottom of the frame, we're going to have our factory jounce stop. There's a hole in the bottom of it that's going to allow us to take a socket, go up to the bottom and unbolt it. So I suggest using a small extension and a deep 13mm socket. That way we can come in start loosening everything up. I will let you know it's pretty tight, but I want to loosen up that bolt until we can get the entire joust stop to come out. Once we have it removed, we can pull the joust bumper down, and this is not going to get reinstalled. Now in your kit, you're going to have a black flange bolt. This is going to thread right into where we just removed the bolt for our factory joust stop. So I'm going to get it started by hand, and we can grab a 15mm socket, and we want to thread this in to where there's only about maybe a ½ inch sticking out of the frame. So you just want to leave it hanging out just like that, and we'll grab our upper bracket. So our upper bracket's going to look like this. One thing I do want to point out is if you look really closely, they are labeled. There's a part number, and you can reference your instructions to see which one's the left or right side, but they are labeled as well. There's an L stamped into the left bracket or the driver's side, and R for the right bracket. Now you're going to notice that we have kind of a keyway hole. There's a large hole and a slot. We want to lift our bracket up so that bolt we just put in the frame comes down to that keyway, and we'll slide it to where it fits into that notch. Now these tabs need to be on the inside of the frame, and these two small holes need to be going towards the front. So we can take our bracket and we'll lift it up and lock it into place. Again, we'll just line up that large keyway and slide our bracket forward. Now obviously we're not going to be able to get a socket in there because it's pretty close to that bracket, but what I suggest is if you get an open-ended wrench, maybe a ratcheting wrench, we can get it into this little notch right here and tighten it up. But as you're tightening, you just want to make sure that the bracket, these tabs on the inside of the frame are touching against it and they're nice and flush. Now, this can be a little bit awkward just because the bracket's trying to move around on you and you're trying to tighten it up at the same time. But, like I said, we just want to get it nice and snug for now to where that bracket's going to sit against the bottom of the frame and have those tabs on the inside. Now if we come down right below the bracket to the rear axle, on the back side towards the tailgate, we're going to have a bolt holding these brackets on that's got our ABS line and our brake lines. We're going to remove that bolt and kind of move this bracket out of the way. So we'll grab a 10mm socket and we'll pull that bolt out. You just want to kind of pull out just a little bit, just kind of move that bracket. If we follow the lines over, we'll find the bracket that's attached to the axle. Now the ABS line is in a little rubber boot on that little notch that's coming out of the bracket. We want to pull that out so that we have some slack and we can move everything out of the way. For now, I'm just going to kind of move my ABS line so it's up towards this bracket. I might just hook the line inside. But if we look at our bracket that's on the axle here, you can see how it stops at that brake line and that little U shape is there. We actually need to get rid of this tab that's sticking out because it's going to interfere with our lower bracket that needs to sit in this general area. So we need to cut this tab off, and typically where that curve starts, if we just follow that straight down and we cut this section of it off, we should be able to fit our lower bracket in. But obviously we have lines and everything extremely close. So whatever you're going to use to cut this, you want to take your time, you want to be careful, and you don't want to nick anything else around here. So I'm going to use a rotary tool with a cutoff wheel on it. But again, I just really want to stress that you need to be extremely careful because everything is very close to all the places that we're actually going to be cutting. Now, you don't have to, but I always like to come back, put a little bit of spray paint on any kind of exposed metal when I'm cutting. It'll just reduce any kind of rust or corrosion from building up. So we're going to grab our lower bracket now, and we need to get this in place so we can mock up and take a measurement. We need to measure the distance between the lower bracket and the upper bracket. Now the way the lower bracket's going to sit in there is we have these two tabs. Those are going to go right around the leaf spring pack, and this is going to sit right on top of the axle. So you can bring your bracket in. Since we got these lines right here, I'm going to come from the front side of the truck. Again, you just kind of want to be mindful of all those lines that are there. But again, we want to take those tabs and they're going to line up with that hole. We're going to have one on the other side as well. But we want to just get it loosely in place. Make sure it's lined up on both sides. And take a little bit of pulling and twisting. But once it's in place, again, we want to measure from the top of the lower bracket to the mounting surface on the upper bracket. So as you measure in between your brackets, you want to pay attention to what measurements you get. Now in your instructions, they're going to let you know that if the measurement in between these two brackets is between 6 3/4 and 7.5 inches, then you're going to need to use the included spacer. Now ours is less than that, so we don't need the spacer and we're not going to be using it in our application. So we're going to take our lower bracket off of our truck now that we have that measurement taken care of. We're going to grab one of the carriage bolts out of our kit. And if you kind of imagine that the bracket was on the truck right now, this is going towards the outside, we want to take our carriage bolt and we want to drop it down through the forward hole in our lower bracket. And we can take our bracket, and we're going to flip it over. And for now, we're just going to set this aside. We're going to grab our air spring. And we want to start with the side that has the 2 holes, not 3, just 2 threaded holes. We'll grab that. Grab a roll plate, and again line up the holes with the thread ones, and then we want to line up the holes on our lower bracket with the holes with our air spring. Now in your application, if you do need to use the spacers, you're going to want to make sure you put the spacer over the roll plate in between the lower bracket. Now since we're not going to be using that, and we're also going to be using the short bolts. If you're using the spacer, you want to use the longer bolts that have the shoulder on them. But for each one of the holes, we're going to take one of our hex bolts, split lock washer, and a flat washer. And we want to get these loosely in place, just enough to where everything will kind of hold itself together, but we still want plenty of movement to where the bracket will slide back and forth. So we can go ahead and flip our assembly over. We've got that carriage bolt coming down to the bottom, and this time on top of the spring we should have those 2 threaded holes and one that's protruding out with another threaded hole in it. That's where our inflation valve is going to go. So we want to get it loosely started by hand. Get it in there as tight as you can with your fingers. We're going to grab a 1/2 inch wrench, a 7/16 wrench, and we want to tighten this up 1.5 more turns. And just make sure that that valve is pointing away from the mounting holes to make it a little bit easier to get everything in place. So now that we have the assembly put together, we want to either lift the body of the truck or allow the rear axle to hang down so there's more space in between that top bracket and the top of the axle. So I'm going to use this pole jack to just lift up the back end so we have a little bit more room. And again, you can do it by lifting up the truck by the frame and just allowing the axle to hang down. We're going to lift our spring assembly in place. Just kind of keep in mind that there's a lot of lines and everything else that's kind of in the way. So we just need to kind of maneuver it in there. And if you squish down on the airbag itself, you can let some of the air out and it will take up a little bit less space. But it is a pretty tight fit now that everything's put together. bracket lined up again to where the holes in the bracket line up with those spring perch holes on both sides, the front and the back. So now that we have it loosely in place, we're going to take our bracket, we're going to line it back up to where all the holes will line up. And instead of using the factory bolt, we want to take the new bolt. There's a little notch on the end of it, and that's actually going to help cut the threads for the bolt itself. So we'll just line everything up. We'll get it started by hand, get a couple threads turned. We'll grab a 13mm socket or a 1/2 inch socket. And I suggest using a hand ratchet. That way we can tell how it's going in and we're not cross-threading it. It's not getting bound up. But we want to tighten this up to where it's nice and flush and it's nice and snug against the spring perch. On the back side of the axle, if we look, there's a small tab. It's got a square hole, just like the one we passed our carriage bolt through. I'm going to go ahead and grab another carriage bolt, drop it down to the bottom, and we can grab our clamp, and you'll notice that the profile is going to fit right at the bottom of the axle. There's a little curve there. We want it to sit like this, so we'll pass our bolts through the two square holes so it sits nice and flush against the bottom of the axle, and we'll secure it down with a couple flange nuts. So for now, I'm just going to get these really loosely on there just by hand, just enough to where that saddle clamp's not going to fall off. To tighten it up, I'm going to be using a 9/16 socket. And whenever you do tighten up those carriage bolts, you kind of want to alternate going back and forth so it doesn't get in a bind and go off to one side. So I'm going to grab our upper roll plate. It's going to be the same for all of them, but we want to grab a roll plate and make sure that the airline fitting goes through the large opening right here. So we can lift it up, make sure that it goes above the spring but below the upper bracket. And again, just kind of want to line up so that that valve in the fitting comes through the roll plate. And then we want to very carefully lower the axle down just enough so that we can get the holes in the bracket lined up with the holes in the airbag itself, and we're going to be using 2 of those 3/8 bolts, that same combination, to secure the bag. So this time we're coming from the top of that bracket, and we need to line up our holes in the bag so that we can get it going through. Now usually what I do is I'll like to lower it down so there's just a very, very small gap to where you can just barely move the roll plate. That'll give you enough room to kind of shift the bag back and forth and move the roll plate so you can at least get a couple threads going, and then you can really tighten down those bolts. I will let you know that it is a little awkward because it's nearly impossible to actually see. But the reason why you want that little bit of a gap is so that you can move the roll plate just enough so you can make sure that those bolts are lined up. And you're not going to be fighting too much trying to get everything lined up and the bolts started. So now we have a U-bolt that we need to get in place as well. This is going to go right over the top of the frame. Just want to be mindful of that electrical cable that you have running over on the driver's side here. But we'll pass it over the top of the frame. Again, just kind of pushing everything out of the way. We're going to rotate it down. And on the upper bracket, we're going to have a couple holes. We want that U-bolt to go through each one of those holes. Just going to have to watch your brake lines and then electrical. Make sure it's not going to interfere. And we can drop it down. And you may want to kind of pay attention to these brake lines. See if you can get the U-bolt on the outside of them, kind of push them towards the frame, or if you want, you can put the U-bolt more towards the inside, close to the frame, and pull those brake lines away. We just don't want them rubbing and touching on those brake lines. Once you have it loosely in place, each one of the legs on the U-bolt is going to get one of these 3/8 flange nuts. And we just want to get this, again, loosely in place so we know that U-bolt's going to hold tight, then we can come back and tighten it up. At this point, since everything's really loose and in place, we want to make sure that our bag is nice and straight up and down. Then we can come back and start tightening up all the hardware. All the bolts holding the brackets to the bags on the bottom and the top, and those flange nuts that are holding the carriage bolts and U-bolts in place. And each one of those is going to use a 9/16 socket. Just keep in mind, some of these bolts are kind of hard to tighten down because of the location, so you may need to use an open-ended wrench to tighten some of them down. So with the bag loosely installed, you want to go back and double check your clearances, make sure you can at least get your hand in between the bag and any other component. The other thing you want to do is go ahead and take a few zip ties and secure all these lines and wires. Make sure they're not going to be rubbing against the bag. You can see I got one here. It's kind of just pulling all those away from the bag itself. So these lines right here attached to this bracket. Then I zip tied my ABS line to that hard brake line here so it's not just dangling. And then on the front side of the axle, we have our e-brake cable actually runs underneath the leaf spring. Well, it was rubbing against the bottom of this plate, and even though it wasn't actually touching the bag, I didn't like the idea of it rubbing there and sitting on there, so I just took a zip tie and zip tied it to the carriage bolt against the axle. That way it still has movement, but it's not going to be running into the airbag itself. Now you're going to want to go ahead and install the passenger side airbag now. It's going to install exactly the same way. There's just a few things. We don't have to worry about all those ABS lines and as much over here. It's just going to be a mirror image of the driver's side. So once you have that in, then we can get ready to start running our air lines and mounting the air inflation valves. We're going to grab our air line. Now, it already has pre-installed inflation valves on there. So the best thing that I always suggest, if you just find the end, both ends, put them together, and we're going to run our hand down until we get to the other end, and that'll let us know right where the center is, or at least close enough. Now, whenever you do cut an airline tube, you want to make sure you make an extremely clean, straight cut. So I'm going to use a pair of tubing cutters, and this will help prevent any kind of leaks when you do go to put them in place. But obviously one line will go to each side. You kind of want to have an idea of where you're going to mount your inflation valves. And ours, we're going to be mounting ours by the license plate, but we're going to get our lines into the airbags, and then we're going to route them that way. So to get the line installed, you're going to take the line, and we'll come to the fitting, and we want to put it into the fitting. It's going to bottom out a little bit, and you want to push till it's fully seated in there. Then grab it and give it a quick tug. It shouldn't come out, but if for whatever reason you do need to take it out, there's a little ring on the end of the inflation valve. If you push the airline tube in, hold that ring back, you should be able to release the airline tube and take it out. But again, you just want to make sure it's all the way seated. It does have a little bit of a give where you'll push it in, it'll kind of stop, but then you really want to push, make sure it bottoms all the way out. So we'll do the same thing for the other one, and again, we'll start routing it towards our license plate. You just want to stay away from any major heat sources, like the exhaust, or any moving parts that may damage your airline tube. Over here on my driver's side, I started routing my airline tube towards the back. Once I got past all these brake lines in that bracket, I went over the cross member here, and I just started running the line following these existing wires until I came back right at the back of the bumper. Now I always like to leave the end of the airline real loose, because once we get the inflation valve mounted, we can typically just kind of coil it up and tie it up high enough to where it's not going to interfere with anything. That way, if we need to reroute any lines or make any kind of changes or anything in the future, we still have extra line. Now on the passenger side here, you can actually see I routed my airline tube going through that opening on the bracket. And that's mainly because we have a dual exhaust system on our truck, and it's extremely close, so I wanted to get that airline as far away as possible. So I started routing it towards the back, and then right about here where our exhaust hanger is, there's a really small gap, and I used that to run my zip tie through. And then I ran my airline tube up and over the cross member, and then again just started routing it towards the back, leaving all the excess loose at the back of the bumper. So here we are at the back of the bumper. Now again, I want to mount our inflation valves pretty close to where the license plate is, and to give you a rough idea for reference, our trailer wiring's over here, and then we have that little plug and trap door that allows us to get our spare down. I'm going to put both my inflation valves right below that, but there's a metal bracket here. Fortunately for us, there is an opening right below that, so I'm just going to put both my inflation valves right in this opening, and I'm going to try to keep them as close together as I can, but also just keep in mind we want to make sure we have enough room to actually get an air chuck onto the valve, so you make sure you space them out far enough. Now, I'm going to be using a 5/16 drill bit, and I'm just going to drill, and fortunately, again, if you go in this center opening, this is just plastic. So we don't have to worry about drilling through metal if you go inside this bracket and stay away from the metal itself. So now we can take one of our inflation valves. We're going to take the small hex nut that comes in our kit. We're going to screw that all the way onto the bottom. Once it bottoms out, take a star washer, slide that over, and we can pass it through. And once we have the valve coming through, we want to grab one of the rubber washers, slide it over the valve. It'll definitely help keep it in place, keep it from falling back through. We'll take a flat washer, and then finally follow it up with another hex nut. I want to tighten this down to where it's nice and snug. Usually you can do it by hand, but if you need to, you can grab a 1/2-inch wrench and socket and snug it up. You just want to make sure you have enough of that valve sticking through so that when you put an airline chuck on there, it can actually fill the valve up. And again, we don't need to really crank on it. We just want to make sure that it's snug and it's not going to work its way loose. The other valve is going to work the same way. Just pay attention to where the valves are and which side of the airline's on, because obviously we want the right side valve to go to the right side bag. Now at this point, we want to take an air check, and we want to put air in both one of our bags because we're going to be checking for leaks. So you don't need to max them out, but you do want to put a decent amount of air in the bags. Now once you got some air in your bags, you're going to get some soapy water, and we're going to spray down the fittings, the bag, and any connection point where we're going to have air coming through and may potentially have a leak. And what we're going to be looking for is little bubbles that are expanding. Now obviously there's some little bubbles because it is soapy water, but right at where the hose meets the inflation valve, that's pretty commonplace for it to leak. So you're looking for those expanding bubbles that kind of keep coming and popping and more expand, because that means the air is pushing on that soap and creating those bubbles. We don't have any bubbles over here, but we're going to continue to spray down the rest of our system and check for leaks. Once you find out that you don't have any leaks, you're ready to hit the road. What I do recommend, if you're not going to be towing though, is that you lower the air pressure down to about 5 psi, or a minimum of 5 psi. That way we can at least have a comfortable ride and we don't have so much air in the bags making it stiff. But again, I'm Rob here at together.If, and that'll finish up your look at the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 air helper springs on our 2017 Ford F-150.